It all began in Switzerland with an area of lush agricultural land and became a dynasty that dominated Southeast Europe for centuries. The Habsburgs' rise to power in the High Middle Ages and its descent into extinction is one of the most fascinating stories in European history. They survived bloody religious wars, alcoholism, and madness, but it's possible that the family's obsession with blood purity is what finally brought about their downfall. Welcome to Medieval Madness. The birth. The first Habsburg that we know of appears in the late 10th century in northern Switzerland and Alsace, at the time known as southern Swabia. Round about the year 1000, a warlord named Count Radbot of Klettgau, who was probably the son of a Germanic noble, founded Castle Habsburg and made it the family seat. Legend has it that Radbot lost his favourite hawk and whilst looking for it found a rocky outcrop which he thought would make a good defensive spot to build a fortress. The name Habsburg therefore came from the word Hab, which means hobby or hawk, and Berg meaning castle. And that's how the family supposedly got its name. Anyway, the Habsburgs didn't even use the name much at first and referred to themselves as the Counts of Alsace. Switzerland was an area of lush agricultural land that was very productive for the Habsburgs, so they didn't even have to tax their tenants heavily on their rise to prominence. Then, at the beginning of the 13th century, the Gotthard Pass opened up and made a route over the Alps to northern Italy by which they could trade large quantities of produce. Over the next couple of centuries, most of the noble families who were all intermarried began to die off, and due to some ancient rite, the Habsburgs were able to inherit their lands. By the time we reached the 11th century, it was Radbot's grandson, Otto II, who was the first to take the name of the castle as his own, and he became the Count of Habsburg. During the 12th century, the Habsburgs teamed up with the Hohenstaufens, who ruled the Duchy of Swabia, and were often at the imperial court, which enabled their rise to power. In 1250, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II died, and a period known as the Great Interregnum began when conflict occurred over who was now the rightful heir to the throne. The Creator. Rudolf of Habsburg had been given to his uncle as a squire when he was about 14 and trained as a knight. When his father, Count Albert IV, died in 1239, it was Rudolf who inherited his large estates and titles. Through his marriage to a Hohenberg heiress, he increased his lands and possessions. And then with the Duchy of Swabia falling apart, he bought up lands all over southwest Germany, becoming incredibly powerful. With the throne empty and the search now on for a new emperor, Rudolf became a contender. Having the former ruler Frederick II as his godfather meant that he was able to put himself forward for the job. There were other candidates, the main one being King Ottokar II of Bohemia, but being related to every member of the Electoral Council has its perks, and Rudolf was voted as King Rudolf I of Germany and crowned in Aachen Cathedral in 1273. It had taken 5 generations from the humble beginnings of Radbot for Habsburg to be elected King of the Germans. Rudolf was described as having great valor, intelligence, and strength, but he was also, by his admission, an insatiable man of war. Now he set his sights on Austria. Ottokar had seized the kingdom after the death of the last Duke of Battenberg, but Rudolf wanted it and defeated and killed the King of Bohemia in 1278 at the Battle of Marchfield. Rudolf now gave the Duchy of Austria to his sons Albert I and Rudolf II, and the Habsburg House of Austria began. His descendants took the Tyrol in the 14th century and became Holy Roman Emperors in the middle of the 15th. The offspring. Procreation was the key to making sure that the Habsburgs could marry into as many European noble families as possible. More children meant more weddings and more connections, so Habsburg men were expected to be particularly productive in the bedroom. After all, the medievals believed that a woman's womb needed a lot of lubrication to prevent it from shriveling. Fertility and the manufacturing of male heirs were also thought to be linked to piety, so there was a lot of devotion to the Catholic Church as well. During the Middle Ages, half of the noble and royal dynasties died off every 100 years due to a lack of male heirs. But the Habsburgs were superheroes when it came to having children. During the 13th and 14th centuries, most of the rulers in Austria tried for around an even dozen, but by the time of the 18th century, monarchs like Empress Maria Theresa were aiming for numbers of around 16. Rudolf I of Germany had 10 children with his first wife Gertrude of Hohenberg, and tried for some more with his second wife Isabella of Burgundy, but she was only 14 when he married her in 1284, and he was 66. That marriage, aside from Isabella herself, remained childless. Rudolf's son Albert I did better. He married Elizabeth, daughter of Count Meinhard of Tyrol, and had 12 children. Later, one Habsburg would go to great lengths to make sure that he would have a male heir. Princess Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel became married to the future Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI of the Austrian Habsburg monarchy. Before her marriage in 1708, the 17-year-old Elizabeth, who was renowned for her beauty, was subjected to a gynecological exam carried out by a doctor and a priest to prove she was fertile. She was immediately under pressure to produce a male heir and was given copious amounts of alcohol to make her more fertile. This resulted in her face having a permanent rosy hue. A boy was born 8 years later, but he died at just 7 months old. When Elizabeth became pregnant again, her husband decorated her bedroom in erotic images in the hope that the baby would be a male. Unsurprisingly, this didn't work. The court doctors now used even stranger methods to try and aid Elizabeth's fertility. She was prescribed a diet so rich that the once beautiful Lily White became an obese alcoholic. So fat that she could not walk, had breathing problems, and needed a special machine to lower her into chairs. Of the 4 children that she did have, only one made it to adulthood, Maria Theresa, who became Holy Roman Empress and ruler of the Habsburg dominions from 1740. The plan. Over the centuries, marriages between various members of ruling families and children born between cousins, uncles, and nieces meant that the Habsburgs ruled over an empire where the sun never set. But it was this obsession to try and marry only into other families that were deemed worthy and often included Habsburg members that probably brought about the dynasty's downfall in the end. The Spanish line of Habsburgs began in the 15th century when Philip I of Burgundy, a state that included pieces of Luxembourg, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, married Joanna of Castile in 1496. Joanna was heir to the Spanish throne. Knowing that they had ascended the throne through marriage, the Habsburgs knew that it could be lost just as easily in the same way. They were determined to hold on to the monarchy in Spain and began to look inward to the family in their search for suitable royal spouses. By the time they had reached the 17th century and the last Habsburg ruler of the Spanish Empire, Charles II, the sad side effects of this interbreeding could be seen in birth defects. Charles was always a sickly child right from birth. When he became king at the age of just 4, he was still breastfeeding and suffering from epilepsy and rickets. When he was 25, King Charles was described by Francesco Niccolini, a Portuguese ecclesiastic diplomat, as, quote, "short rather than tall, not badly formed, ugly of face. He has a long neck, a long face that curves inwards, the lower lip typical of the House of Austria. He can't straighten his body, rather when he walks he curls up against a wall, a table, or something else. His body is as weak as his mind. Occasionally he shows some intelligence, memory, or liveliness, but not now. In general, he has a slow and indifferent demeanor, clumsy and indolent, appearing stupefied. One can do what they like with him, as he lacks his own will." It's hardly the picture of virile health that a ruler was expected to have. The parents of Charles II were Philip IV and Marianne of Austria, and they were uncle and niece. But because of the prevalence of consanguinity with one family member marrying another over so many generations, they might as well have been brother and sister. The consequences. The facial deformity suffered by Charles II became known as the Habsburg jaw or the Habsburg chin, and was passed down the Spanish line, gaining momentum and worsening over time. One modern geneticist pointed out that when a person is born they receive 2 versions of each gene, one from the father and one from the mother. A dominant gene will come to the forefront and mask a recessive gene. But in the case of the Habsburgs' excessive interbreeding, the protruding jawline was likely a recessive feature that came forward because each child born was inheriting 2 equally defective pairs. The ratio of blood kinship for Philip I stood at just 0.025, but by the time Charles II was born it had gone up to 0.25. That meant that a quarter of the genes that he received from each parent were the same. Of the 11 marriages by Spanish monarchs between 1450 and 1661, most of them had some element of kinship. And the progression of the facial deformity can easily be seen by comparing portraits of the Habsburgs, starting with Philip I of Castile, who was the first Habsburg monarch of Spain and known as the Handsome, down through the ages to Charles II, whose reign began in 1665, and who was, quote, so handicapped that both his speech and his ability to easily chew food were impacted. Charles II's health was so bad it's thought that it's what led to the end of the line for the Habsburgs, and it's still debated whether his inability to produce an heir was due to chronic interbreeding, although his autopsy report concluded that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous, and he had a single testicle black as coal. King of the World. The marriage between Philip the Handsome and Queen Joanna of Castile meant even further expansion of the Habsburg Empire. Their overseas lands included northern Taiwan, the Philippines, Guam, outposts in West Africa, China, India, and most of the New World. Their son, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, ruled over not only his kingdoms in Europe, but also domains that stretched out over another 3 continents, and he became the first world monarch. Of all Europe's dynasties, nothing seemed to be able to stop the domination of the Habsburgs. From the Middle Ages through to the modern era, the House of Habsburg produced counts, dukes and archdukes, grand princes of Transylvania, emperors, empresses, and kings of Hungary, Spain, Croatia, Portugal, Bohemia, England, and Mexico. Although perhaps in the end it was their fight for world domination and to preserve the bloodline through interbreeding that made them the masters of their own downfall. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Hope you have a great week. Cheers!